All right, welcome everyone. I'm gonna give folks a few moments to join and then we'll start with a quick intro. All right, great. It looks like we've got some folks already jumping in, so I'll go ahead and get started. Want to welcome everyone today. Thank you so much for joining for Architecting Success, Channel Structures for Building Product Manufacturers. Today, we're going to be hearing from Stephen Gaynor. Stephen is an advisor at Acelab and the president of Pivot, and Vardhan Mehta, who is a second-gen architect and the CEO of Acelab. To start, Stephen is going to guide us through analyzing the common channel structures employed by building product manufacturers, assessing pros and cons of utilizing each, and some insider tips for doing so. And then afterwards, we're going to hear from Vardhan, who's going to present the 2025 Specification Investment Guide for Manufacturers. We will have some time for questions, so if you have any questions throughout today's event, feel free to submit them to the Q&A. We'll keep our eye on those and we should have some time to answer them live. If we don't get to your question live, we'll have a record and we can follow up with you after today's event. All right, awesome. Whenever you're ready, Stephen, feel free to go ahead and get started with the first portion.
Excellent. Let me share my screen. All right. Well, thank you, Bo. Thank you, Vardhan, and the whole Acelab team. I'm excited to be again talking about what I do for most of my day. This is the third series in or the third module in a series that we've done with Acelab. We've already done the last two over the summer and earlier this year. Just so you guys know, again, my name is Steve Gaynor. My company is Pivot. I help building product manufacturers through mostly product entry and then testing, certification, compliance on the exterior building product side. I'm also, like Bo said, a advisor for Acelab, and I'm the co-chair at the Rain Screen Association. And you know, what you're going to see today is again just a sort of an excerpt of what I often give to managers and executives that are coming into the building product space or the facade product space, and it really goes over you know, the channel structures that are used in the facade space, both sort of on the complex side, something like you know, very highly customized products, and then also on the distributor side. Just to review what we did for the first couple series, you know, series one was all about how the characteristics of your product lead to the decision making for your strategy going to market. And so we talked about, you know, the different types of products, right? You see on the screen, we talked about visible products that have sort of service oriented needs, and then you have, you know, your technical products, and depending on what that mix is, then it determines who your targets are, how you approach those targets, and then, you know, sales structures to match that. Then for series two, we really talked about what project-based sales means. And so we got into sort of the key features of project-based sales, and some advantages of going with project-based sales, and also some of the challenges in terms of implementing a true project-based sales structure. We went through a few of the maps, and that'll look familiar for what we're going to go through today. And then we went through the project process and talked about how a project-based sales structure sort of is implemented within the project process and what you need at different stages. Now, today, again, we're going to talk about the channel structures, and this is, you know, routes to market that are used for, I'm sure, for you and your competitors to go from the factory floor to the wall. We're going to talk a little bit about what the channel structure is, and then, you know, go through some common channel structures, and then, you know, the costs and benefits of different structures, and finally addressing the gaps in those structures. So first and foremost, you know, there's a few slides here on what a channel structure is. And yeah, before we really define that, I want to sort of think about the needs and stakeholders in here. And so the first question is, what is it that a commercial building product manufacturer does best, right? And the answer to that is obviously running a factory. They manufacture products. They like to do that. They're set up to do that. They know how to do that. And then the question is, okay, how do you get from the finished product on the factory floor to turning it into a building? And the first thing we're all going to say is, well, it's going to be the contractors do that. The installer is probably going to be the one that does that. But the real question then gets to, what are all the steps in between? How does the installer get it? And you start to ask, okay, which contractor, where do they get it? What else do they need with your product? Who decides on that package, that engineered package? Who's going to pay for engineering? Then all of the peripherals around that. And I'm not going to go through each of these, but you can see this is just sort of an excerpt of what you're going to consider when you're considering how to get from the factory floor to the folks that are installing this. So, the real answer is we really don't know how it gets to the installer. The question is, what have you designed, right? And so that's really the whole point of today, is to say, you should be intentionally looking at what this structure looks like and intentionally designing it. So that gets to our first poll. And if you're talking about the channel structure for your business, the question is, and I think Bo, you going to pull up that poll, or? Yeah, perfect. So the real question is, do you know what position is typically responsible for designing and maintaining the channel structure strategy, right? And so who's responsible for determining within your company the how that product goes from the factory floor to getting to the installer or onto the wall even? So there's a few good answers, and there's one definitely wrong answer here. And I don't know if we're ready to pull up the results. All right. So, I think this is an interesting turnout because I think it's not really well known, who does it. And also some structures maybe don't contain, the different roles. So the answer typically is, if you have a product manager, that product manager is responsible for it. And you might have the CEO or someone else sort of directing that. But if there is a product management position, that product manager should be responsible for how this is designed. Now, they're going to take, obviously, direction from the CEO. They're going to take input from the marketing manager and from sales manager, but they're responsible for designing and maintaining that. So now we're going to answer that question. What is a channel structure? A product channel structure refers to the various paths a product takes from the manufacturer to the end consumer. It outlines the product journey through intermediaries which add value by increasing access, packaging complementary components, and or adding services, right? So that's it. It's really what we talked about, how to get from the factory floor to the end consumer. And the end consumer, we might be talking about the installer contractor, might just be talking about it getting on the wall somehow, or even the owner or users of that building. So when you're setting up your channel structure design, that you have to think about a few different things, right? And so I'm going to start, your product, your strategy, and then your customer needs. Your product limitations might have a lot to do with how you set up your channel structure, right? If you have something that's highly customized and maybe requires special handling or equipment or something like that, you're typically not going to be able to just send that out through distribution or through a one-step channel, right? You probably can't send that directly to your end user unless you are incorporating a lot of that. You probably have to consider the different steps that your product has to go through before it gets to them. Then, as far as manufacturer strategy, there's a lot of reasons why you might choose different structures for your channel to market. One of them is you might just want to vertically integrate, right? That's gonna lead to more control over this, more margin for you. It allows you to sort of be more involved in this whole process, maybe even just control the relationship with your end user more. obviously, core competencies come into this, and your brand awareness in the market. If you're a manufacturer that just wants to manufacture, then you probably don't want to consider vertically integrate, but you still have to consider what goes into that, and that's where you go into your customer needs, right? So for your customer needs, really what you're talking about is what needs to be packaged with my product in order to make it easiest for the customer to buy that, accept it, install it, whatever that is, make it easier for the customer. And this is something that, particularly for America and in the facade segment, is really important, because we have developed an industry where the installers, for the most part, expect the option of a fully packaged engineered system where they can get everything they need for the job in one delivery, and it's sort of set to them like almost like a piece of furniture from IKEA. And if you're thinking about that, that aspect, and you're thinking about the product that you develop, then you're thinking, okay, how do we get from this piece of product that we develop to all the things that need to go with that to get to that package that gets them? So, just to start off, we've talked about these customer needs. One of the things it might be, you're designing your channel structure because around like local exposure, right? You need local exposure for your product. Or maybe your customers need local inventory. Maybe you're not ordering everything at once for a project. Maybe they need to be able to get parts and pieces here and there. And then, finally, in terms of access, you might just want to buy into a channel, right? And that's target familiarity. Maybe your target is more familiar with these channels or with these channel partners than they are with you, and you're saying, okay, we want to partner with them just so we have that familiarity with our target customer. Finally, or I'm sorry, in the middle of this, we have the additional services column, and this is where customers in this segment often expect a package of services and components that go with your product. And if you are or not willing to incorporate those, then that determines how your channel is designed. So additional services might be consultative sales support, design assistance, things like fractional order sizing, right? And I know a lot of factories who say, okay, this is what we want to put out. This is our minimum order size, and this is sometimes the entire reason to have a distribution network. Then there's other things like shop drawings and field measurements on more complex product paths. And finally, complementary components. And this is really, one of the things where if you are vertically integrating and you're a manufacturer and you're selling direct to your customer, you're often selling things that you don't produce just so that the customer has easier access to your product. But if you don't do that, then you have to consider where they're going to get primers, paints, sealants, attachment systems, trims, flashings, all, et cetera. That list can go on. So if we're considering all of that, then the question is, how do we set up a route to market based on what we want to do, right? If I'm a manufacturer that wants to be fully involved, to have full access to my customer, then I'm going to do one thing. If I'm a manufacturer that really just wants to focus on manufacturing, I'm going to do another thing. So we're going to go over 4 routes to market. You'll see the different paths for those products through the routes to market. Now, the key here is that these are really just example routes to market, and that there is some amount of sort of gray area or addition that manufacturers use to each of these. So you don't have a whole lot of clean routes to market, but this pretty well describes the best path or the typical paths. And just before we go over this, I'm going to use the cladding panel manufacturer as an example, mostly because they have the most complexity in the chain, and that really we can pick out the different parts of it that refer to other products. And they also have the most involvement, which usually requires multiple levels of sort of risk mitigation considerations. So sticking with that cladding manufacturer mindset and going to our first model, the first model we're going to go through is direct to contractor full service, right? And regardless of whether you're a panel manufacturer or another manufacturer, you see on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, the manufacturer is responsible for all sales and marketing, all technical data and detailing, installation guidance supports, and really the first and last front in compliance. And you're pretty much always going to be responsible for that unless we do a hands-off model, which is one of the last things we'll talk about. But if you're a panel manufacturer and you're trying to go direct to the installer, you see this list of things that you have to include with your panels. You have to include substructure, you have to include fabrication, you have to include shop drawings, engineering, job site support, and you have to package these all together. We typically call this a material engineered package. And, and if you're going to do this direct to the customer, you're going to have that all in-house, or at least have it perceived to be all in-house, right? There's a lot of manufacturers out there who will do third-party substructure, third-party fabrication, third-party shops, third-party engineering, and you don't even know it as the contractor because it looks like it comes from the panel manufacturer. But this gives the panel manufacturer, the most control. You see, if they're sending this to this material engineered package to the installer, then the installer installs it. And then they're contracted with the general contractor, who's contracted with the owner, and obviously we know the architect has a big role to play in terms of this process, especially as it goes through submittals and approvals. So for this model, why do manufacturers do this? The first thing is full control, and I remember one of the CEOs that I reported to, he used to come over here and he used to say, Steve, no bad projects, right? First and foremost, we want no bad projects, and then we'll talk about everything else. And that really has stuck with me. This is really the type of model you want when you want no bad projects, because you have full control. You also own the relationship with the customer, right? And that's something that a lot of manufacturers or a lot of companies want to make sure that they have, so that relationship, so that they can be as flexible as possible. And then, going down the list, there's some other things involved here. And we all heard that sort of one neck to choke, right? Architects, owners, GCs love to hear that there's only one. When something goes wrong, we only go to one supplier here. But then also from a manufacturer standpoint, remember, you're capturing all of those different services that are typically, dispersed throughout your channel. So you're able to capture more margin, right? And that's a big reason why some manufacturers do this. But in order to do that, remember, this is also going to be resource heavy, because you need to have all of those services in-house, or at least the project management services in-house to manage all that, right? You also have additional sort of liability because you're involved with all of these steps, and when things go wrong, you're the first one up. So let's move to model number two. Model number two is really the open to everything model, and I really see this on two sides of the spectrum. On one side, we see this where manufacturers really don't know or haven't controlled their routes to market. On the other side, we see manufacturers that are really sales focused and saying, we want to capture every sale that we possibly can, so we're going to make sure that we are everywhere, right? And I'm going to sort of discard that first one for a moment and talk about this as a truly designed channel, right? It looks a little hectic because it is a little hectic, right? If you're trying to get every route to market, you're going to be hitting a lot of direct customers, and you're going to be setting up a lot of unique relationships. And then the other thing is you're going to be creating a lot of conflicts, right? Because you're going to be going to folks that are customers of your customers and competitors of your customers, et cetera. And so there is a lot to manage here. But again, if you're going to go, be open to everything, you're going to go through maybe distribution. That's going to go to the installers, and then you're going to go maybe directly to those installers. Also, give them the option to buy directly from you. Sometimes you'll go through an aggregator. You see this facade systems fabricator. That's a company that might aggregate all these things together, provide project management, shop drawings, engineering, all that stuff. Also maybe fabricate panels or fabricate your material and get it to the installer. And then all of those folks go, the installer, the fabricating installer, all go to the general contractor. The general contractor doesn't get to see everything that went into this. They just get bids from the installers and fabricating installers, assuming they're all the same. And then that again goes to the building owner. The question is, why do manufacturers do this? And again, there's two answers. One of them is that leave no stone unturned sales mentality. And I think that's really the reason why we do this from a truly a designed channel to market standpoint. Then there are a bunch of companies out there who I think this is a response to fragmentation of the channel structure. They don't want to make choices, so they end up selling to everybody, and that's where things start to go wrong. Because if you're not intentionally doing this, then those conflicts you create in your channel structure really end up biting you. Why don't they do this? And again, this is you have resource heavy services. You as a manufacturer also then have to control. Okay, if I'm spending all this money and time on my internal resources, how do I make sure I get enough flow through that channel in order to justify that and not have it go through some of those lower cost, lower margin channels. The other thing is, again, you're competing with your own customers often by selling to their customers, and that's something that is hard to resolve. I've been there, and I've been with companies who've been there, and ultimately, I'll tell you, you have to resolve it in some way. So finally, if we talk about sort of those conflicts, one of the things that that a lot of manufacturers settle on is this sort of limited balance model. And for this model, we're talking about going direct to those companies that have the ability to provide a bunch of these services on their own, and they really need just some basic services from the manufacturer, right? And so this is going to be, I call them a fabricating installer. This is a more sophisticated installer that usually has a lot of these services in-house that they can do. And then there's these facade systems fabricators, again, aggregators that sell to installers. And in the panel market, this is typically the way that that you go to sort of avoid having that direct involvement in projects, but still maintaining some amount of control over your customer and the end product. Again, why folks do it, again, mostly because of control, limiting your liability, but you do lose access to a majority of the installers, right? A majority of the installers out there either need or want some sort of full engineered package, and so from that standpoint, you do have that cost with this model. The other thing that happens is you also have a lower margin sale because you're not providing all of those services that the installer needs. You're moving that to someone else in your channel structure, and so again, you're reducing the margin possibilities for your sale. Now, if we talked about the product route to market, I just wanted to hit on the sales channel map on top of those. So regardless of those route to markets that we talked about for your product, for your sales channel, you're pretty much doing the same thing regardless. You're typically having an architectural rep, right, whether that's direct or independent, and they are typically not only servicing the architect, but also managing the installer network. Now, the thing to look out for here is if your architectural rep is managing your installer network, the conflicts you create are gonna land directly on them, and it's never great to have your customers feel sour about your rep. But you see here, they're going directly to those installers that are going to your general contractor. Now, if we take the substructure supplier, right? So I just took the panel suppliers, we just went through all that. It really looks exactly the same from a substructure supplier or from a component supplier that's more technical or customized components. We take a full service model. It looks pretty much the same. Some substructure suppliers even want to carry the paper on the panel themselves. They might contract directly with the panel manufacturer and provide a full service. Other times they'll go in as a separate package from that. But again, they have that full service model available to them. The same thing with the limited service model. It looks almost exactly the same, except you're not packaging it with that panel, right? You're letting those panel manufacturers go directly to those installers, but you're still providing all of that same amount of project management and services associated with that. Now, here's your second poll. Let's bring that second poll up. Why might manufacturers want to vertically integrate, right? And this is sort of a have you been listening question, preparing for the test at the end. I think that there's a lot of considerations here when it comes to vertically integrating, and a lot of that comes down to the risk appetite for the manufacturer. Obviously, as a business, you want to try to get into your highest margin opportunities, but you see a lot of manufacturers out there choose not to, and often it comes down to both their core competencies and their risk appetite. So let's pull up the poll here. All right. So there was there was 3 good answers here. There's one bad answer and one answer that I guess you could have chosen. But reducing liability for project mistakes is one of the biggest ones. All right, let's continue. So again, all of that seems like a lot of work to manage. If I'm a manufacturer saying, do I really need to do all that? I just want to sell this product that comes off my line. Why can't I just sell it directly and not worry about all of that? I think some companies out there you'll notice actually do this, right? This is they'll manufacture something, they'll market it, and then send it out. And somewhere in the ether, all of those services still have to happen because the contractor still needs those services. You just don't control it, right? And so, in terms of a model, this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is a good commodity model, but it's not great in terms of having control of of quality, having your customer relationships be under your control. It's also one of these things where it's really good for sort of lower margin products, but maybe not so much for higher margin products because there's not enough control in the sales process to have those opportunities. Now, let's say we don't want to control everything, but we also don't want to have our hands in everything because our risk appetite, our culture, whatever. This is where you get into the sort of this hands-off model. And there's a few companies out there, you probably know of them, that really service these manufacturers. Say, I just want to produce this thing. You take it into America and you do everything. We will supplement some of your marketing, some of your technical costs, and all that. But you do everything else, and then you go and take care of all the services that the installer needs, and go directly to the installer, fabricating installer, whoever. Obviously, you lose a lot of control here, but you really stick to your core competency, which is manufacturing material. Now, the big thing here is there's limited investment, there's limited risk, and you can focus on what you want. Obviously, it's a much lower margin sale, and you don't have much control there. Now, let's take something that's a little, a product's a little less complex. You typically have, a distribution network for those products where customers already pretty much know how to use those products. It's less customized to a project, and from that standpoint, you can then go to these local distributors who may or may not hold inventory, who may or may not have these local relationships, and really count on their expertise in the market. This is something that often happens for smaller components, for things like membranes and coatings, et cetera. And you have the manufacturer going to the distributor, and that distributor really, still the manufacturer's, in control of their marketing, testing, compliance, technical tools, et cetera. But then the distributor is in charge of, having a local sales team, making sure that projects are serviced. Most project inquiries. Often manufacturers with this will also have sort of that direct project support as part of their package. But this is a typical model for those types of products. For a sales network for distributors, the one thing I want to mention here is you still have your architectural rep. Usually, you still want to create demand from that pull side, but you also have a distributor rep. And the difference between distributor reps and architectural reps, we can talk about culturally. There's a lot of difference. But also, your distributor rep is typically going to be larger regions, making sure your product is out there. You have good relationships with your distributors. Your architects really focus on projects, right? And that's going to be the difference in those sales models. On a final note here, it's really your job to design your channel structure, and you have to do it intentionally. It's really a must, or else things get out of control. You create problems. It should be designed to meet your customers' needs and crafted to fit your goals, right? And that's really how you think about a sales structure. So that's the end of our series here. The last poll here, if you want to bring it up, is do you want to see more webinars in this series? There's a few different titles here. Even though some of these titles might seem funny, I think we've all experienced these different challenges when it comes to whether it's your product or dealing with your sales team, etc. So yeah, looking to get some feedback here, and then we're going to turn it over to Vardhan to talk about Acelab and some of the things that integrate here. All right, question number 3. What we got, though? Boom, sales superstar to struggling manager. I love it. Yes. All right, Vardhan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Awesome. Hey, this was great. I learned a lot. One thought I had during the presentation was I wish we also opened this up to the architect users on Acelab. So, as architects, we gain a little bit more empathy for how long manufacturers take to get back to us. Like when you see the entire structure, I think it just helps to put everything into the lens of like, well, it's not that simple as just a price code, lead time, inquiry answered, and so on. Anyway, as I'm looking around the virtual room, I'm seeing a dozen or so Acelab partner manufacturers in the audience. So welcome, glad you guys are here. Hopefully, all the content that Steven shared was super helpful. I'm seeing some new faces as well. So maybe I'll start with a quick intro about myself. We're going to go into a deep dive on the specification investment guide for 2025 and some of the trends that we've been noticing with Acelab. And then finally, for folks who are joining us for the first time in the series or have not been introduced to Acelab yet, we'll also include a little bit just about Acelab and how we operate and so on. So I'm a second-gen architect, grew up in India. Dad's an architect, uncle's an engineer. Went to architecture school in New York, then practiced at a top 10 firm in the city. For better or worse, like while I was doing projects for the State Department, which are like US embassies around the world, or institutional projects for MIT and Yale, I got roped into the areas of practice which you don't really go to design school for, which is specifications, working with manufacturers, and so on. So like the more reality of AEC, and really started to understand the process very well. Found some areas which I was incredibly frustrated with as a junior, new entry-level architect. And that led to the founding of Acelab. So as I mentioned, I'm going to go into Acelab a little bit later, but essentially we work as a matchmaker between architects and manufacturers. So I think like the right segue here from what Steven shared is, a lot of the channel structures certainly included, architects or the specifier as like one of these 3 main stakeholders on the project, the others being the owner and the contractor. And so hopefully like the insights we're going to share in the specification guide are helpful as you guys think about, as you think more about channel structures, how to go to market with those channel structures, how to activate the channel structures, and how to get the projects flowing through the channel structure effectively. So let me share my screen, and then we're going to go into this guide now. Whoops. All right, super. Hope you all can see my screen okay. So the goal of the specification investment guide was really supposed to help sales and marketing and even like product professionals from building product manufacturers to get a sense of the pulse on the architect and specifier side. There's about 13,500 architecture firms that use Acelab to manage all their material decision-making. In this case, we surveyed about 600 architects from that selection to get qualitative feedback about how they're doing what they're doing related to materials. Where do they look, at what stage in the project, what does the collaboration with manufacturers look like, and so on. So we're going to share some trends there. We also surveyed about 200 manufacturers, sales and marketing executives, primarily, again, to get feedback around what they've seen based on their wealth of experience, or even in the most like, in the more like recent past. And then we also stitched this together with other similar reports and data sets like AIA, Deltec, Dodge, and so on. So what you're going to see next is really focusing on, like the needs of the hour, which really is, I mean, like the primary topic that most manufacturers are thinking about and paying attention to is, of course, the architecture firm billings index, which now for a cycle of 12 months or so has been under 50. And that's usually a big um, uh, danger factor or red flag about where things are trending. Obviously, with the news from last week, things may certainly improve, but just for folks from the construction industry, which I would imagine is most of the people attending the webinar right now, we all know that things don't happen overnight, and it takes time for things to bounce back and to go back into the normal mode. So this guide's focus is to help manufacturers allocate resources effectively in a down market. So really focus on the must-haves as opposed to the nice-to-haves. Maximize specification rates while the competition is increasing. We're constantly seeing other entrants in the market. I think Stephen alluded to that a little bit, but European, Asian manufacturers entering the American market is on the rise. Discovering channels again to foster more of those meaningful, lasting relationships with AEC firms at a time again when reliability, trust, and value add on a project can often be the most effective way to retain the spec. And then finally, achieving higher ROI. So here we've got like a matrix of what's the cost per lead across all the approaches or initiatives a manufacturer can invest in. And then how does that fare against the quality of those leads? So I'm going to go into that in a little bit as well. Starting with the most important things first. This is what we're calling the architect preferences hexagon. So these are the 6 key insights from the report. I'm just going to go through all of them like one by one. I mean, as you can see, like the numbers are pretty significantly high across the board. So I'm going to focus more on the insight itself. I'm going to start with prefer integrated specification solutions. I think here the insight is architects are feeling overburdened with the amount of information in the marketplace. This isn't just related to specification, but also the other dozen or two responsibilities that the average architect has to juggle, and the tools and platforms and technology and the people they have to interface with, to get the deliverables in place. So we're seeing a big interest in integration across the board, and also to minimize the errors and back and forth and so on across all the tools or the technology that the architect might be using. Sustainability, there's been a steady rise in terms of new certification programs. It's hard to keep up with both for architects and manufacturers, but there's obviously some incentives either for, let's say, something like LEED, which has historically been areas where architects are really focused, but then also now related to the budget of the project, maybe something related to grants, government spending, and so on. And I think here again, we're seeing interest from architects for ability from manufacturers to be able to communicate effectively how does the product address sustainability. And it may not be like a catch-all term for sustainability, but there may be like really specific takeaways for the architect that they can take to the rest of the stakeholders on the project. Increased reliance on the digital tools. I mean, this has been on up and up since the pandemic. Even right now, as some architecture firms are starting to go back to hybrid work schedules and so on, the reliance on the digital tools for everything related from initial research, working with manufacturers, shortlisting, samples, any of this RFI submittal management is certainly very attractive to architects. Next, I think education still remains to be like a big gap in our AC industry. I think it also just goes back to not enough architects, new architects entering the practice wanting to be on the technical side, but rather being on the design side. And at some point, you have to cross over after a certain amount of experience in the industry. You have to cross over to also knowing enough on the technical side so you can deliver on both ends of the project. And so that education being on demand, timely, when the architect needs it and not having to return or reference the thick steel manuals and other stuff that we read in architecture school, but don't obviously remember like when the time arises. And like 3 out of 4 architects we surveyed, I think it's important to note that I think the appetite for collaboration, I think, is similar to both architects and manufacturers, and that being ongoing. I think it's great news for manufacturers in that it's the gift that keeps on giving. But at the same time, for architects, it goes back to trust, reliability, and wanting to work with folks that you've already known from the earlier stages of the project or even like historically as a firm standard and a trusted advisor. Finally, most like being receptive during the earliest stages of the process. I think like for most manufacturers and sales rep and specification folks, it's a no-brainer. But usually in SD and DD, that's when the architects are most freed up to entertain new ideas, new education, to brainstorm what they've done in the past and how they might want to do something differently on the project. And then as you get closer to the later stages of DD and even into CD, that time quickly evaporates with impending deadlines and schedules and back and forth and so on. So these are some of the I'm sure like super obvious, but again, like as we poll these architects and manufacturers about their experience with the connections, I think it was like very revealing that these 6 things really stood out. And I think like just from an architect standpoint, the 3 big areas where we're seeing a priority is first in integration. So less piecemeal tools or solutions and more end-to-end workflows. Automation, so being able to get education, answers, documentation on demand. I mean, I think this also just maps to a generally speaking, a shorter attention span across the board. And when you need something, you need it like yesterday. Centralization, like having tools or ways, like means to get from initial research, being able to work with rep, getting all the deliverables out the door in the same tools. So some of the areas now, if you were to compare the effectiveness, I'll start with the traditional approaches. I think again, like a few of these areas, I'm sure you guys have like felt the impact of or the lack of with something like a trade show where the attendance is declining. A lot of times we heard from manufacturers during these surveys that usually for the trade shows where architects are in audience or attendance, there's a lot of focus on CEUs and a bit less on building relationships with manufacturers who might be exhibiting at the shows and so on. So even that social value of being at a trade show, I know it exists in a great way for manufacturer to manufacturer, but sometimes it's been reporting to be like absent from like manufacturers and architects in between them. Magazine ads, I think, especially with AI, like now, like a bit more emphasis from architects of using agents and other ways of searching through the information they need and the answers they need. Reliance on news platforms or the media platforms are starting to go down. And then also just the fact that, with advertisements where not really, like as a manufacturer, you're not really being shown in an unbiased way. And for architects, that's huge, generally being an audience or folks who are sales and marketing averse, just to oversimplify or overgeneralize. Lunch and learns, I think, these remain to be a great resource for both the architect, to learn about topics that they may not have subject matter expertise in, but then also for manufacturers to build new relationships. It may not always be about a project that is, happening or active in the moment, but it's always great, for that relationship building and more of the quality relationships. I think the feedback we heard from manufacturers in this case was, it's hard to scale, with all the travel and expenses of the free sandwiches. It can be difficult unless you are one of the top 10 manufacturers in a category and you've got a rep in every single region or state. The other thing is we've heard that also there's been a little bit more focus on the virtual webinars even for firms which have an office, there may be like a hybrid attendance, some folks attending in the office, some virtually. Spec and BIM libraries. I think again, like we've seen a big shift in terms of technology with AI, with ML being more and more absorbed at architecture firms. So the reliance on a repository which only offers information is a bit less valuable than places which can just offer you an answer. And it may often be also from some manufacturers who have actually invested into their own technologies, like their own versions of Chat GPT or visualization tools to help the architect effectively specify or to get educated in areas where the architect will find most helpful. So I think like repositories as a theme or places which just host information in one place. Like the value of that is like like a little bit unclear, especially at this time, with how technologies are evolving. Sampling platforms. I think here the most interesting feedback was we'd asked architects for how long from receiving a sample do you tend to keep that at the firm? And so I think it was like very revealing that 3 out of 4 samples get discharged, like thrown away from the architecture firm within the first month. And I think a big factor, like when we think about like what may be leading to that is, well, first, like, if it just if it's about the texture or the feel that just isn't right, then architects are not using this like really precious real estate in their firm library towards those samples. It may be that if it's really easy for architects to order samples at scale in high volume, maybe when they would just offer one if they had to pay something or if it required a little bit effort. If it was super easy for them to just offer like a dozen or to order a dozen and have those shipped and sent to them overnight, maybe they would just order a lot more than what is actually like required on the project. And it may be that like a lot of those samples, thinking just about the pipeline, just get immediately displaced. Finally, with the CEU services and for organizing like AIA-based CEUs of webinars, I think here like the general feedback we've just heard about, like there's no information about projects. It's great for education, but it's not as impactful for manufacturers to be able to track those relationships or even to have a follow-up beyond this like an hour-long CEU. Finally, going to spec platforms. I think the feedback here was mixed. We heard from manufacturers that it's great for existing relationships with architecture firms that keep on specifying them, already know them, and they also know that they exist in the spec editing or documentation tool. So it's great for those architects and for the manufacturers to rely on that retention, but it can be hard to grow new relationships based on that. And then finally, like lead gen tools, I think like examples would be like Dodge or CMD. I think the feedback like generally across the board was the quality of leads, or being like inaccurate, being too late in the process, where it's hard for them to engage the architect in that channel structure and be able to influence the direction, educate the architect, build trust, and so on. So this matrix takes all of these learnings across these sort of like a dozen or so traditional and digital approaches that we talked about and ranks them to compare how it fares between the cost and the quality of leads. And I think like here it's important to annotate, like while for cost it is it's objective, for the quality based on what we've heard from manufacturers is successful and is required. Here we're placing that as the ability to get accurate, actionable, early project relationships with architecture firms or leads. For anybody that's like taking screenshots of the report or, for any of these slides, feel free to reach out to us afterwards as well, and we'd be happy to share this report with you after the webinar. But I think, some big areas of realization here might be at a time when, the budgets are shrinking, being able to choose investment areas that can help you to optimize on both the cost and and the quality is what we're recommending. And I think like as a part of that, I'm going to come back to this, but go one slide forward. We also just put together this sort of investment strategy, breaking down all the different tools and areas which can be impactful for manufacturers, and what is like a good way to break that down across the sales or marketing spending. Here are some line items of just like tools and strategies or tactics that we've heard from manufacturers to be effective. I won't go through the entire list, but it includes things like tools that help with early stage engagement to enter the project in the earliest stages, increasing the brand awareness or presence in through the digital channels, educational content if you don't have CEOs, if you don't have a means of engaging the architect with something beyond the products, and then tools that can really help to remove the cone of silence that most manufacturers report hitting when you have an initial inquiry from the architect, maybe through your own website or through any of these tools and channels. But after the initial inquiry, if you hit a cone of silence where you don't have any visibility into the project, what is the requirement of the architect? What might be the follow-up required in terms of the architect's needs? So prioritizing channels that that can optimize for that visibility. Finally, I'll just wrap up here with like a quick intro on Acelab. So we built Acelab as a two-sided platform. It's entirely free for architecture firms and for design firms. And there's about 13,500 using the platform at the moment. On the other side, and I should say for those architects and design firms, they're using Acelab for centralizing the firm's institutional knowledge, coordinate the decision making all the way from SD towards CD or when it'll be documented, and then also documenting that with specs and schedules directly in the platform. We are a team of architects. I think this was very important and meaningful in how we shaped the product. We felt a big gap in the industry for tools that could offer information for every product in the same place, but then also could offer recommendations on to how to optimize the firm standards. Because usually an architect is specifying upwards of 100 different products into any project, most of which just get repeated over and over again. And I think like with Acelab, we found a way to supply those recommendations to the architect in a way that's unbiased and they trust, and it's backed by data, not just data about the manufacturers, but then also to tie it back to data from other architecture firms, what they're choosing in similar types of projects, geographies, specializations, and so on. On the other side, we work with about upwards of 100 manufacturers and really helping them, to get in front of the right architects at the right time in the project. So more of a focus on the quality relationships as opposed to the project leads. I'll just wrap up here and happy to answer any questions from the audience more about what we do with manufacturers. But I think what we found is you can't really just be focused at the top of the funnel or at the bottom of the funnel. You really need a program to proactively reach the architect at every stage in the project. And so we do that through education, promotion, and recommendation. A few examples I'll mention here of stuff that's included in our program for manufacturers is we organize webinars with the users in our audience. And so it's based on the segment of architecture firms and projects you're most in the sweet spot for, so that you are starting with like a target or more sniper approach to which architects you're educating and so on. We also do the development of the content in terms of helping you to differentiate with the architect of what's truly unique about your product or your solution as a manufacturer. We load up all the information on the platform with all the content that an architect might need eventually as they go through the decision making in the form of CAD, BIM, specs, and so on. We've got partnerships with other media companies in the AEC space, like the Architect magazine, and we utilize their audience as well as a way to double down and expand the reach of our manufacturers. I think like one big area for manufacturers that's tough is to differentiate between the types of inquiries from architects. And oftentimes that really like elongates that lead time for a response back to the architect. So as a team of architects, we do feel like our superpower is being able to talk to architects and understand what is the thing that they actually need for a specific product selection, a specific manufacturer, and so on. And so we actually offer live support for all manufacturers we have a partnership with on their branded landing page. So if an architect shows up after a webinar or from a product page, we can actually help to qualify what is it that the architect actually needs. And it could be a price code, lead time sample, and so on. And then we loop in the sales rep or the specific rep based on that. And then, I think like another area where we're truly differentiated is we advise architecture firms as an independent infinite resource. So, for architects, it's really valuable in that we're not a window or cladding salesman, but we're playing the role of another architect, a fellow architect who can advise them on baseline information that they might not have. And with that, we actually are able to sort of help them optimize a product selection, which they may not have thought about in a decade, but we can help them to optimize that based on factors like the cost, availability, design optionality, sustainability, aesthetics, and so on. And then, the end game for us is to bridge that gap and, to create a direct highway between the right architects and projects and the right manufacturers. So I'll end at that. I think, Bo, we may want to open it up for Q&A. We only have like 4 minutes left, but maybe we've got a little bit of time, for anybody that would like to ask any questions for Stephen or I. Feel free to add questions in chat and we'll get right on it. Thank you.
We do have a few questions, but reminder, if you want to submit a question now, if we don't have some time to get to it, we can follow up with you. But starting off with a question for Stephen, how do we know which model is best for our organization? You're on mute.
There we go. I mean, that's a great question. So it really has to do with what, for me, it's about how much involvement you want in the channel or in sort of that value add channel structure, right? It's if a manufacturer is just, and a lot of manufacturers just want to focus on manufacturing, then obviously you're going to choose a channel structure where we get less involved in projects. If you're really saying, okay, we want to be in control of sales, want to have higher margin, then you're going to choose a channel structure that gets you involved further down the line. And I presented those 4, but it's there's a combination of uses out there, and so you can sort of craft what you want from that depending on how involved you want to be. As an employee, I was charged with getting us to a certain point that the manufacturer was comfortable with, and then setting everything up beyond that.
Awesome. All right. Next one, also for Stephen. How do you measure the efficiency of your current distribution team?
Yeah, I mean that's a really hard one. I think one of the things that we've done in the past is take sort of construction activity and then given us that gave us sort of a relative position of our goals for each market, and then that gave us an opportunity to say, okay, if our overall goal is this and construction activity is this, then we should be here in a market. But I think beyond that, I think there's an opportunity on the sales side to look at sort of efficiency tools. I mean, Acelab is one of them, but you have a whole bunch that you can sort of add to your quiver.
Awesome. All right, great. Let's see, we might have time for one more. Okay, if somebody is interested in learning some more about Acelab's program, Bardon, what are your suggestions on next steps for them?
Yeah, I think we're going to send out a post-event survey after the webinar, which will also include a recording. So if there's somebody in your organization, that would benefit from learning more about uh, the channel structures or about this specification investment guide, feel free to share that recording with them. But there'll also be information about being able to book a personalized demo where you can see a little bit more about the platform and the tech, and then also meet a few architects from the team who can talk through strategy and get to know your offerings a little bit more better.
Awesome. All right, great. Well, I think that about brings us to time. So just want to thank all of our attendees again for coming out today and joining us for today's webinar. And thank you, Stephen and Vardhan, for a great presentation. Yeah, we'll be sending some follow-up information. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us after that.
Fantastic. All right,
Thanks.
guys. Thanks so
Have a
much.
great
Have a great week. Bye.